Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Dr. Stringer, and we're talking about crime detection and investigation this week in our Police in America class. So I will be giving you all some notes and kind of the high points of this, and hopefully you've already read your chapter. So usually I start this in my campus class with this Dave Chappelle skit that's called "I Plead the Fifth." However, if I do it for you all, you won't be able to hear it. However, I did post it on D2L. So if you haven't watched that yet, you might want to go and watch it because it's pretty funny. But anyway, it kind of gets at the Fifth Amendment, and he's pleading the Fifth about various things. For those of you that don't remember, your Fifth Amendment is your right against self-incrimination. So that's why he's pleading the Fifth. Anyway, so let's do this, and we will get into crime detection and investigation. So like I said before, some discussion questions. When we teach this on campus, I usually have a few discussion questions that we break up into groups and talk about. But since we're not doing all of that, since you all aren't here with me, and we're not teaching this class synchronous, I thought I'd just give them to you just to kind of as thinking points. So think about the difference between inculpatory and exculpatory evidence, and you're probably like, what? What is the difference in this? So inculpatory evidence is something that would tend to prove someone is guilty of a crime, and exculpatory evidence is something that would prove that someone is innocent of a crime. So that's pretty simple there with two pretty big words that sound pretty cool though, right? So you've probably heard before that, when someone's prosecuted, that the prosecution has to turn over any exculpatory evidence to the defense. That's required under the Brady versus Maryland Supreme Court decision. So we won't get into too much of the details of that. But anyway, so what is DNA and why is it useful? DNA has become really prolific in the last few years. They caught a serial killer in California after 30 years because of the Ancestry.com DNA data, which is a new way that they're using this data. Anybody that's convicted of a felony, they have to have their DNA put in a database. And then anytime someone is convicted of someone commits a crime and they find DNA, they test it against this database and then see if they get a match. If they do, then they will probably be coming to see you to see if you can explain why your DNA was found at a crime scene. Well, they actually find issues or solve cold cases this way. Because maybe their DNA was found at a crime scene, but they weren't in the database at the time, but then they got convicted of another crime, which was the felony, so then they had to put their DNA in that repository, and then it hit a match as soon as they submitted their DNA. So that's another way it's used, too. And your textbook goes into some more detail about this as well. I just think it's interesting. Obviously you're using it with rapes and murders a little bit more than other things as well. Interestingly, one of the things they do with DNA now is if they collect DNA, but they don't have a match for it, they'll actually issue an arrest warrant for that DNA strain, even if they don't know the person's name, particularly in rape cases and things like that have a statute of limitations. It's not a big deal with murder because most states that I've heard of don't really have any kind of statute of limitations on murder. But this way, the statute of limitations doesn't kick in because you're a fugitive from justice and the statute of limitations does not apply to that. So it's one of the interesting little ways that they found to do that. And then, if they find the person's match later on down the road, they can prosecute them and not have to worry about the statute of limitations. I talked about the 3 standards of proof in criminal matters last lecture, so I won't bore you all too much with all of that and being repetitive. There's reasonable suspicion for a Terry stop or a stop and frisk. Another thing I told you was they call it a Terry stop sometimes because it was decided under the Terry versus Ohio decision, so that's why they call it a Terry stop. And then you have probable cause, which is what you need for search warrants or to search any property or anything without a warrant or to make an arrest. And then the other big one in criminal matters is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which you probably all know is what you need for a conviction in a criminal court. There's some other burdens of proof. There's a preponderance of evidence and clear and convincing evidence and stuff like that. I don't remember if your textbook goes into that detail or not, but those are predominantly used in civil matters, so I don't tend to worry about them as much for a policing class because they're used in civil court. The difference between an interview and an interrogation. Well, this is one of the things that I always tell students, and we have a big discussion about this when I teach face-to-face, when we teach policing. The difference between an interview and an interrogation. And I think I'm going to have you all watch this video about this later on in class. But most detectives will tell you that there's not really a lot of a difference between an interview and an interrogation because they conduct them the same way. Because they don't want the suspect to know that they're being interrogated, so they'll usually conduct it the same way as an interview. Plus, interrogation sounds like a more nasty word, right? It sounds like you're waterboarding people and things like that. It's like, no, we're just interviewing them. And if you go down to the police station, everyone that I've ever seen, the rooms where they conduct these interviews or interrogations is called interview room A or interview room 1 or 2, 3, A, B, and C, whatever they use, letters or numbers. And part of the way they do that is to get people to come down willingly and talk to them. And if they do that, then they don't have to use the Miranda warnings and all that because they're down there, they're not in custody. One of the things we'll talk about later is that Miranda only applies for custodial interrogations. So if someone's not under arrest or being held in custody, then you don't have to read them their Miranda warnings, and so that evidence can still be kept in. And so that's a big way detectives will say, hey, we wanted to talk to you about this. Can you come down? We heard that you might have been a witness or something like that. And then get the person to come down there willingly. And they'll tell them you're free to leave at any time and, all that good stuff. So that way you don't have to worry about that. Not only does it help with Miranda, but it also makes the person more willing to talk to you. If you tell them, can you come down here for an interrogation, they're probably going to show up with a lawyer, right, if they come down at all. So that's something to think about. We'll talk about the different types of undercover investigations. I think there's a PowerPoint slide on that, and why some of them might be controversial. I think that one of the big reasons why they tend to be controversial is because of the issue of entrapment, and we'll get into that as I digress. I've already talked 8 minutes on the first slide. Anyway, so criminal investigations defined. The criminal investigation is the process of collecting crime-related information to reach goals. Now, what is this information? Evidence, right? You're generally trying to collect evidence to reach a goal. And what is your goal? To solve the crime, to convict the suspect, to make the victim happy, to get the property back. In the process that you're doing this, you're conducting an investigation. You're doing searches. You're doing interviews. You're going and checking various DNA repositories and stuff like that. And so this is the way that the investigation is conducted. So there's some main types of criminal investigations. There's your reactive investigation, which is essentially, hey, we got a report of a murder. And so then you react to that report and you go and investigate the murder. It could be a rape or burglary, things like that. Cold case investigations, some of y'all have probably heard of cold case investigations before because of the TV shows. And so cold case investigations are usually these big ticket crimes, the rapes, robberies, murders, things like that happened quite some time ago and they were unsolved. And so then maybe they might reopen the case if they get new evidence or something like that to see if maybe they can solve it. Or maybe it was a murder from before there was DNA technology, and now they have some blood sample that they want to go and test and see if there's a match in the CODIS system or something like that. And then you have your undercover investigations. This is pretty self-explanatory as well. It's essentially, a police officer is in plain clothes and they go undercover to detect crime better, because people tend to commit more crimes when there's not people wearing blue uniforms standing there watching them. Go figure, right? And so just some general types of undercover operations. You have your stings, your decoy operations you see less often. Your undercover fencing operations you see even less often. Stakeouts you've probably seen on TV. And your surveillance operations. So, your book goes into some detail about all of these. I think that it's pretty good at clarifying, what they're all about. The sting, you might want to go and catch some child molesters or something like that, right? So I forget, what was the news channel that was doing that for a while, trying to get people on Craigslist? I can't think of it now. But anyway, and then maybe your decoy operations. Maybe you leave a backpack out and see if anyone steals it, or leave your cell phone in an area where things have been being stolen from to see if someone steals it. Leave a backpack at an airport. They were doing this in New York for a while. They were leaving a backpack, and then anyone that picked up the backpack and didn't immediately give it to a police officer that was nearby, they would charge with theft. And so it became a little bit problematic, and it's like, well, did the person really intend on keeping this backpack, or were they going to give it to another police officer? Were they going to give it to the lost and found? Were they going to, I don't know, check it and see if they could find the person's ID card and take it back to them? And so they ended up not prosecuting a bunch of those cases. The only ones that they prosecuted, interestingly, were the ones where the person that took the backpack actually went into the backpack, found the wallet, took the money out of the wallet, and put it in their own pocket. And they were able to make a case and say, okay, well, if they went into the backpack, took the money out, and put it in their own wallet, then we can make the case that they intended to keep this money permanently, and they did commit theft. Because that's one of the elements of larceny, is that you have to prove that they took this and they intended to permanently keep it. They weren't just taking it for a brief time. Undercover fencing operations, your book talks about them. Honestly, I've never seen one except for in the movies, which is essentially where they set up this big operation that is supposed to be buying things. And this is just an example of one. Maybe it's a place where they buy stolen property, and then, criminals that steal things bring it there. I just don't see this happening, and one of the reasons is, it would take a lot of time, money, and manpower to set up a whole operation like this. And then once you caught and arrested the first couple of people, the word would be out and you wouldn't be able to do it anymore. No one would take their stolen stuff and sell it to you anymore. So I don't know. Maybe some of you have heard other things. You can talk about it in the discussion if you know more about this than me, because I've never seen or heard of it being done other than in the movies, like I said. Stakeouts and surveillance. Surveillance goes on all the time, where this is very big in your drug enforcement and things like that, where you're surveilling the drug dealers and staking out the house and stuff like that. And then the issue is, that makes this controversial, is the idea of entrapment. Well, are you entrapping these people? So the way they define entrapment is did the police actions solicit this person to commit a crime that they wouldn't ordinarily have committed? So, is the backpack there? Would this person have stolen this backpack if, we hadn't put it there, if someone else had put it there? It's very easy with the child molestation cases to say, well, this person was actively going on Craigslist and trying to find children to have sex with. So it's pretty clear to say that they would have been doing this regardless of whether we set up this sting or not. So they don't have a very good case for entrapment. Surveillance, I don't think you can really make a case for entrapment there either, right? Because surveillance, you're not really doing anything but watching people, right? So it's really hard to prove entrapment as well for these reasons. And so, a lot of people, especially defendants, will say, well, it was entrapment and things like that. I don't know. It's very difficult to prove, and people very rarely get off on it because you did commit a crime. Anyway, so I've already talked about the burdens of proof, so I won't go too much into all of that, but there they are if you're a visual learner and like to see that kind of stuff. Looking at evidence, circumstances, and the effort to go into things. This is the percentage of offenses that are actually cleared by an arrest or some other exceptional means. And you see here that you get your murders and your negligent manslaughter, you have a much higher clearance rate. It's about 64%. They put a lot of effort into this. Your more serious offenses, right? So clearances, aggravated assault, that's up there, 50, violent crimes, 47. Rapes are actually, sadly, down at 38%. I don't know why that is. That's a really good question because, especially since most people that are raped by someone they know. You would think that would be pretty easy to solve. That's not really my area of expertise, though, but I'll have to ask some other people about that because that's curious. Robberies are really low because most people are robbed by people they don't know, and they just can kind of give a description of them. Motor vehicle thefts are pretty low as well. Arson's really low, and that's just really hard to solve because of the destruction of evidence in the fire. Burglaries are much lower as well. So you see these violent crimes being much higher. They put a lot of effort into them, and also most of the time when people are, the victim of some sort of murder or something like that, aggravated assault, it's someone that they know, so it makes it much easier to clear that crime. But it does, vary a lot across the amount of evidence that's present, the circumstances, and the effort. I guess the one thing I could say is the circumstances with a rape case is maybe the victim doesn't want to prosecute, so maybe that's why they don't make an arrest. But I know some states are actually cracking down on that and making it, especially with domestic violence too, and making it so that the officers don't have any discretion and they have to make an arrest. Georgia is not one of those states, no. Anyway, so there's another table, just looking at this. If you need another study guide for standards of proof to make an arrest, conviction, make sure that you remember that this is for searches too, for probable cause. And this gets into, is it more likely than not that a particular reason to conduct the search exists? I think this is from your textbook as well. Anyway, I already talked about inculpatory versus exculpatory evidence, so I won't get into that too much already. Again, direct versus indirect evidence is an interesting one to think about. Direct evidence, you have a video of, or the police have a video of, someone shooting someone. That's pretty much direct evidence that that person shot that person, right? Well, suppose we find the gun, we don't have the video, but we find the gun that shot the person and it has your fingerprints on it. Well, that's really not direct evidence that you're the one that shot them, right? It's direct evidence that you touched that gun at some point in time, but it would be more considered to be indirect evidence that you were the person that shot them. It would be direct evidence that you touched the gun, just not that you shot them. Indirect evidence is also referred to as circumstantial evidence. And you'll probably learn more about evidence when you take your courts class, and they'll get into more of the nuts and bolts of all of this. But for now, and also many people are under the misconception that circumstantial evidence cannot be used in the criminal matters, and that's completely inappropriate and inaccurate. Circumstantial evidence can be admitted, And people have been convicted on nothing other than circumstantial evidence, which is, you say it can be pretty rough. You probably didn't have a very good lawyer if you got convicted of, or with a bunch of circumstantial evidence. Then again, it doesn't really matter how good of a lawyer you have. If there's a video that shows you shooting the person and, they're dead, then you're probably going to get convicted of murder regardless of how good your lawyer is. Different types of evidence. So there's what's called physical evidence, and that is, used to prove that a crime occurred, right? And it's also used to prove that maybe you're the person that committed the crime. So there's, percentage of, physical evidence in trial outcomes. You see, in homicides, you tend to have a lot of physical evidence. You'll have the body of the victim most of the time. You usually have some sort of murder weapon. You'll have DNA of the victim. You might even have DNA and fingerprints, gunshot residue off the hands of the shooter, things like that. And then these other things you see that you often have some physical evidence as well. It's important to remember that you have to not only prove that someone committed a crime, but that a crime occurred. So you have to prove, so to speak, the corpus delicti, which is the body of a crime, which means that a crime actually happened. So, in many cases when the mob kills people, they don't leave a body to be found. They'll feed them to the alligators in Florida or something like that. Because if there's no body, then it becomes a missing persons report, right? Well, we can't prove that this person's dead, so it's a missing persons investigation, not a murder investigation, which, you can't convict someone of murder if they're missing. You don't know if they're dead or alive. They're just not here. They could have gone to Acapulco or Costa Rica or, somewhere else, and they just left. And the body is really the best way to prove that, a murder was committed. However, there have been cases where, if there's a whole lot of blood in the house and they don't have the body, you can get an expert to testify that there was so much of that person's blood was in that house that there's no way that they could have possibly still be alive after losing that much blood. And you can use that to prove that a murder exists or occurred. And I'm just using murder as an example. You have to prove that, any other crime occurred as well, right? Which can be challenging sometimes. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, just like everything else. And then there's your biological evidence, your DNA evidence, so to speak, your fingerprints, stuff like that. Fingerprints, they're pretty self-explanatory, right? You guys might not know this, but when they actually roll the fingerprints, when they fingerprint someone that's deceased, they actually cut the skin off of their finger. They cut the fingertip off of their finger, and they put gloves on their hand, and then they put the fingertip over their finger, and then they roll it to get the fingerprint. That's something I learned from forensic people, which I thought was kind of gross and mortem or mortis. I don't know. Anyway, DNA. Allegedly, everybody has different DNA, although they have not tested everybody in the entire world. I think there's one type of twins where they have the same DNA, but other than that, everybody has different DNA. And DNA is actually, a short term for this long word, which I don't know how to pronounce, deoxyribonucleic acid. I don't know. We'll just call it DNA. You won't be tested on how to pronounce that, I'm sure. But anyway, for those of you that don't know, the CODIS database is actually this database where everybody's DNA goes to when they're convicted of a felony, or the DNA is collected from a crime scene and stuff like that. It's this huge nationwide database where all this DNA is housed. And so it's called CODIS. And just so you all know that that's the DNA database. So eyewitness identification is actually used in order to convict people and figure out who committed a crime, things like that. I had this video of an eyewitness test too that I usually show my campus students, but I can't show you all that either. It's really a bummer. Anyway, This mugshot over here is actually the mugshot of Ernesto Miranda for Miranda versus Arizona. I don't know if y'all can tell, but he's actually number one. And he's the only person in here wearing a white T-shirt, the only person with glasses, and he's number one. And of course, he was picked out. And this is an example of what is known as a lineup. So you get some people that look similar, and you put them in there and you ask the witness or the victim to pick them out of the lineup. There's also some other methods that are used. Right now, with technology being what it is, detectives and police use more of something closer to a mugshot book, only it's on a computer, where people will just go through a computer and look at a bunch of mugshots and then try to pick the person out. You see this a lot of times in crimes where there's a victim. They try to pick out the assailant, the person that raped them or robbed them, and things like that. So that's a mugshot. You can actually have a photo lineup too, where they present it's a piece of paper or cardboard or something where they put maybe 4 different pictures on there. So it essentially is the same as this, except for the person's not physically there. It's just a bunch of pictures, and then you pick the person out of that. The show up is actually the least reliable one, and the show up is actually used most of the time at the scene of a crime, and that's where you just have the person that you've caught and you say, hey, is this the person who did it? It's particularly used, if you have a break-in or something like that, and the person's nearby, maybe the police catch him, or maybe he runs from the scene, but the police chase him, and then they catch him, and they bring him back, and, you hold him, and, he's handcuffed, and they say, hey, is this the guy that broke into the house? And you say yes, and they arrest him. That's a means of identification, believe it or not. Even though I would argue it's not as reliable because you don't have other people there to compare them to. But the police wouldn't be able to make that arrest without you identifying them. Some other types of investigative evidence are what is known as a confession. A confession is the most powerful and persuasive form of evidence. I've never heard of anyone getting off who has had their confession admitted into trial against them. Because the jury is going to say, well, you admitted to this. You wrote out a whole statement where you said that you did this. And when someone does that, you don't need to really present all of these other things. And this is why detectives and police officers really like to get confessions, because it makes their job so much easier. They don't have to collect more evidence to figure out who, or to be able to prove that they did it. They usually already have a suspect who they've identified, and then they, essentially try to crack them to get them to talk. Here's a little copy of the Miranda warnings, just for those of you that are interested in that. It's made in the form of a little card that police officers will often carry if they haven't memorized the Miranda warnings, so that way they can read it right off of there before they engage in a custodial interrogation of somebody. Some of you might wonder and say, well, how come, the cops have asked me questions before when they pulled me over or something? They didn't read me my Miranda warnings. Well, that's actually one of the exceptions to that, is they don't have to do that when they're doing a traffic stop. They can ask you questions without your Miranda warnings. And I've always said, but when you're stopped in a traffic stop, you're not free to leave. If you leave, they're going to chase you, right? So you're in kind of custody, so to speak, because you're not allowed to go anywhere. And in any other circumstance, that they would define that as you being in custody, as if you're not free to leave. If you're at the police station and they tell you you're not free to leave, then you are in custody, right? If you're in handcuffs, you're in custody, most likely, right? Anyway, I won't go into too long of a diatribe there. Crime scene profiling is something that some people do. It's generally done with serial killers or, not mass shooters, but, these we had a shooter in Northern Virginia one time. He was going all through the Beltline. They called him the Beltline shooter. He was going through Northern Virginia and D.C. and Maryland, all around that Beltline around D.C. there. And so part of his profile was that he went all around the Beltline area there. So anyway, so forensic analysts will a lot of times try to come up with these profiles of these serial killers and stuff in order to try to predict where they're going to, strike next, right? In order to help prevent them from committing more crimes, and also, to help solve the crime as well. So information from the public is also a very helpful thing to have, right? You've probably heard in TV about, doing a neighborhood canvas. Maybe if a house is broken into, you might go and talk to the neighbors to see if they heard anything or saw anything weird or any weird, unusual, vehicles around and things like that. Nowadays, what's really popular too with the advent of technology is to go and look around to see if there are any houses that have cameras that are nearby to the area where the crime occurred. It doesn't have to be houses; it could be businesses and things like that, to see if there's any surveillance cameras. Especially nowadays with those new, a lot of people are getting the doorbell cameras, and so those can be very helpful with solving things like that as well. That's another piece of evidence, right? Video evidence. Video evidence is right up there with a confession, right? I think traditionally the confession has been considered the most powerful piece of evidence because you're admitting that you did it, right? But the video of you doing it, that would be right up there with it, I would imagine. And that's something that's relatively new. It wasn't quite so prolific in earlier decades. Anyway, confidential informants. They are another type of evidence that you might use in your investigations. You might find, especially with drug investigations, that you might have what's called a CI, a confidential informant, who are associated with the criminal underworld, and they assist you in gathering evidence and tell you things and wear wires and go and talk to people. Nowadays, it's not just audio wires; it's video too. It's particularly useful narcotics investigations. Like I say, the DEA is really big into that. They'll catch some low-level person and then be like, well, we don't really want you. We want the person that you got the drugs from. And then they'll try to go up the ladder from the low-level dealer to the higher up, until they get to the supplier by using each person as a confidential informant as they go up the line there. Gang intelligence is another, type of evidence that you might use. Gang members are disproportionately involved in criminal activity. I know that comes as a surprise to many of you, but believe it or not, they are. And many departments have a specialized gang unit, and this is usually in areas that have a lot of gangs. So they might gather information. They usually document tattoos and stuff like that a lot. And you'll see a lot of that in corrections, too, with the documentation of the tattoos. Gangs have their own tattoos and stuff, which I'm not really that familiar with. But anyway, crime analysis. And this is another way that they collect data on things. And so if you look at, remember we talked about the 80-20 rule, about how, most of the crime occurs in small places. Well, you might do an analysis with the crime data to figure out exactly where these hotspots are and try to target them, so that way you can help reduce the crime a little bit. Electronic databases, I mentioned that already, are great sources. We already talked about CODIS, that's your DNA database. You also have the NCIC, which is National Criminal Information Center. They are the ones that house everybody's criminal history. So if you want to know what criminal history someone has, you get it from NCIC. I think they have a GCIC as well in Georgia, which is the Georgia Criminal Information Center. And then APHIS as well. And I think your book has an I before the A, and for APHIS. Everybody else in the whole world, with the exception of the author of your book, calls it APHIS with AFIS. I think the author of your book has it IAFIS. AFIS stands for Automated Fingerprint Identification System. And so this is the database that houses all the fingerprints. And so whenever someone gets arrested, they put their fingerprints, they fingerprint them, and then that goes in this AFIS database. So then whenever, similar to, DNA, whenever there's a crime committed and they find fingerprints on the doorknob and stuff, they lift those fingerprints up. You've probably seen this in CSI, as much as I don't like talking about CSI because it's so unreal. But anyway, and then they go and run it against this AFIS database. Fingerprint technology has been around for a lot longer than DNA, so, AFIS has been used for a lot longer and to solve crimes than DNA has, because we just recently got that technology not that long ago. So some other forms of evidence that you might think about are computers and other electronic devices. Digital evidence has become really big. Like I said, videos are a great one. But you also have documents, phone numbers, locations of devices. Your phone really tells you where you go all the time if they can hack into that. Emails, photos, text messages, all that stuff. Drug dealers, with all the texting nowadays, their text message history is a real piece of evidence to use against drug dealers. Digital evidence is a big one nowadays, too. Recently, I don't know if y'all heard, it's not so recently now, this is probably 2 years ago, this frat party at Penn State where the guy fell down the stairs and died. They actually had cameras in that frat house, and the fraternity guys had tried to delete the hard drives of that in order to destroy the camera evidence, but y'all have probably heard before that you can't actually delete stuff from a computer. It's still in there somewhere. And so then they got in a lot of trouble because that computer, whatever hard drive that they had used that stored the camera footage, was sent to the FBI, and the FBI, of course, recovered all of the footage. And so not only do they have that evidence against them, but they also got an additional charge for destroying evidence because of that. So, digital evidence is really prolific nowadays. If you're trying to convict someone of a crime, even if you can't get the location data from their cell phone itself, a lot of times you can track which cell phones were in an area at a time, by which, cell phone devices are bouncing off which cell phone towers and stuff like that. They've done that with a couple of murder investigations where they just didn't have any suspects at all. They just found, the case I'm thinking of was actually a police officer that was off duty that was just found dead in a ditch. And they didn't have any suspects at all to go with, so they started going and looking at cell phones and to find out who would have been in that area around the time that the officer died, in order to identify some possible suspects. And then, of course, there's probably more than a handful of people, so you have to go and talk to all those people, find out what they were doing there, whether they're accounted for or not, whether they're being really weird when you talk to them, and look for all of these things, whether they're being deceptive and things like that, whether they have someone who can account for the fact that they weren't killing someone during the time when they were there, whether someone else was with them, all of these things. Anyway, the last thing I think I'm going to talk about is social networking and internet sites. These have become quite a big piece of criminal investigations nowadays. From Craigslist, like I mentioned earlier, with the child molesters, but also with Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. When detectives get a suspect nowadays, one of the first things they do is they say, let's go check him out online. They'll Google your name and find your Facebook or your Twitter and all that to see what you're, up to and stuff. And people will post where they were and all this. And that could be used to put you at a crime scene. If you posted a picture of yourself at some bar and then someone got killed at that bar that night and you're already a suspect, and it's not looking so good for you. One case we had some years ago was someone he was on parole. He was a gang member. He had allegedly been out of the gang, and he only had a little bit of time left on his parole. But then And one of his conditions of his parole was he was not allowed to get he wasn't supposed to be affiliated with gang members. He wasn't to get any new gang tattoos, and all these other things. There's a whole laundry list of stuff. And then this genius, I say genius sarcastically, not long before he was about to get off parole, went and got a new tattoo. It was a new gang tattoo. And guess where he posted a picture of his new gang tattoo? That's right. He posted it on Facebook. And so he got his parole officer, during his, supervision of him, went and checked out his Facebook page and found this tattoo. And he got a one-way ticket right on back to prison, all for a tattoo. So I'd say this, you all be careful what you post online. I'm sure none of you are out there involved in gangs and crime and things like that. But you're going to be applying for jobs at some point in time, and you don't want, especially if you're criminal justice majors looking for criminal justice jobs, you don't want them finding your Facebook page with a picture of you taking a bong hit, or even a keg stand. Maybe it might not be seen as the most professional thing, right? Especially if you're underage. So keep these things in mind with your data and your identity out there. I know everybody's been thinking, well, I got the privacy settings set and blah, blah, blah. Well, there's ways to get beyond your privacy settings, believe it or not. Zuckerberg is not locking a vault on all that information and is more than happy to cooperate with people if they ask for that information. So keep that in mind. Anyway, so with that, I'm going to sign off. I talked to you all a little bit longer than I anticipated today, but hey, we had a lot to say. Hopefully you learned a little bit, so I hope you all have a good rest of your day. And don't forget to do your quiz and your discussion post, and I'll talk to you next time. All right, bye.